Hello, I'm Lam Abu Salah, and this is part 3 of the Java series where I explain Java programming step by step so you can navigate with ease. This video will be all about variables, identifiers, data types, and how we use them in our code. A variable is kind of like a container. It stores a specific value or item within it. There are several kinds of variables. This is where data types come into play. A data type is the kind of content a variable can hold. So for example, a whole number is called an integer in mathematics. It is also called an int in Java, which stands for integer. Data types split into two main sections, primitive and reference. A primitive data type holds a known amount of a specific content type. Examples are integers, doubles, floats, and booleans, which basically are true or false. A reference data type does not hold a specific type of content, and we cannot predict the size of the data it can hold. Examples are strings, arrays, and classes. As we've learned before, we need to have a class and main method set up for our code to work. Inside the block of the main method, we can place a variable or function. Let's start with the simplest data type, the integer. We will write int, and then what we want to call our variable. The name we give it is simply called its identifier, as in it is what we use to identify this variable. I'll name my variable x. There are ground rules to naming our variables. It has to start with a letter, a lowercase letter and not an uppercase one. We cannot start it with a special character unless it is one of two, which are the exceptions, an underscore or a $sign. Yes, this is a valid identifier. Other special characters and numbers are allowed to be included in the name, just not at the beginning. So if I were to add a 9 right here, it is allowed. It has to be less than or equal to 256 characters long. But honestly, who makes their identifiers that long? The name cannot contain a space. So if I were to add a space between the $sign and the 9, this would cause an error. Two variables cannot have the same identifier, so if I were to name this identifier x, an identifier cannot be a reserved word, so something like class would be considered wrong. It can contain a reserved word, so if I were to say a string is called my string, this will be considered allowed, but it cannot be the reserved word itself, so string named string. A few extra rules you need to apply when dealing with variables are, when dealing with a specific data type, you have to make its value the same as the data type. To clear that up, let's look at some examples. Within an integer, you can't type a word or a decimal, so if I were to assign a value of 3.0 to this variable x, this would cause an error. Same thing goes for if I make a variable y and then place hello inside of it as a value. When assigning a value to a string, you have to place your value within double quotes. So if I have a string named A, and I assign a value of hello to it without the double quotes, this will also cause an error. Within a character, you can only type one character and not more. So if I have a character N, and I assign its value to be NBC, this would cause an error to occur. Speaking of characters, your characters should always be within single quotes, otherwise the character won't be accepted. If you don't follow this general rule, your terminal will display a type mismatch, an error. Let's see right here. And let's hit run. Do you see how many type mismatches we've gotten? To make your computer differentiate between a double and a float, you have to follow a float up with a lowercase f. This tells the compiler that the number we're dealing with is a float and not a double. So if I were to say float n is equal to 3.14, this would cause an error, as in it would give you a type mismatch because it considers it a double value inside a float. The value assigned to a boolean shall always be true or false, otherwise an error will occur. Same thing will happen. Boolean y is equal to, let's say, ABC. What is the difference between declaration, assignment, and initialization? Declaration is the method we use to notify the program that this variable exists. It doesn't require us to give it a value, though. You can only declare a variable once. More than that, and an error will occur. So if I wanted to declare an integer and name it x, I would write int x and then end it with a semicolon. I cannot go on and name another integer x, or even any data type x. Do you see this red line over here? This indicates an error. You can declare multiple variables together and in one line, if and only if they have the same data type. We do this by adding commas between them. So integer x, y, and maybe even z, and then we end them with a semicolon. This does work. Several data types in one line will mess up our code and will produce an error. Assignment is the method we use to give a variable a value. This could be by giving the variable an initial value, or by changing the value in another section of our code. So if I were to give the variable x a value of 3, because it is an integer, so it has to be 3, not hello, not 3.0, not a character, for example, an exclamation mark, nothing of that sort. It has to be an integer. So it has to be x equals 3. We use an equal sign to assign a value to our variable. You can't assign several variable values in the same line though, like we could in the declaration. Initialization is a fast coder's best friend. It is simply a combination of declaration and assignment done in one step. You cannot initialize a variable except once in your code, unlike when we could in the assignment. So if I want to initialize a variable, I could say int a equals 3. This basically combined the two processes of declaration and assignment. Like declaration, you can initialize multiple variables, like if I were to say a equals 3, comma, which separates them, like in the declaration, and then b equals 5, for example. But the only exception is they have to also be the same data type. If they're not the same data type, a type mismatch or an error will occur. This marks the end of our tutorial. So if you've benefited, leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with those who might also benefit from it. If you have a question, feel free to comment it down below and I'll be more than glad to help. Thank you for watching.